Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of William Henry Harrison, and the focus is hard cider and log cabin campaign. The year is 1836. It is a presidential campaign year. Andrew Jackson's on his way out after 2 terms, and he's handpicked his vice president, Martin Van Buren, to be his successor. The question is, who would run against him? The two-party system had actually gone by the wayside a little bit, but with Jackson in power, it had come back, and there was a clear party of opposition now rallying around Henry Clay and his Whig party that was focused on his American system with federally funded internal improvements and high protective tariffs and an active role of the federal government in the lives of the American people. And Harrison and Clay had actually been aligned for a long time with their Western roots. Clay had been a supporter of Harrison's, and Harrison's name was in the mix as one of the potential Whig candidates for president here in 1836. One of the things he wanted to make sure was that the people in the South had nothing to worry about when it came to William Henry Harrison, a Northerner, when it came to slavery. Harrison made the comment that the course pursued by the emancipationists is unconstitutional. Neither the states where slavery, does not exist, nor the government of the United States can, without usurpation of power and the violation of a solemn compact, do anything to remove it without the consent of those who are immediately interested. So a Northerner potentially going to get support from the South for his position on slavery. Well, there were several candidates in the mix as the Whigs couldn't unite really around a single candidate. In addition to Harrison, you had Hugh of Tennessee, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, Willie Mangum of North Carolina was in the mix. But some of the states started to fall into Harrison's side of the equation. Pennsylvania was one of the first that came out in favor of Harrison. Maryland, Ohio, Detroit, Vermont, Delaware, and then New York, the biggest one of all, also expressing support for Harrison's candidacy. Now, historically, electioneering, campaigning was frowned upon in the American system of government, especially at the highest levels. But Harrison did go out on a speaking tour across a number of states in the East Coast, ostensibly a get-to-know-you kind of tour. It wasn't a very political kind of speeches, but it was an important opportunity to get in front of a whole new bunch of folks, and it was considered largely a success. But in the end, it was not going to be enough to overcome the momentum of the Jacksons, and Van Buren actually won the election pretty easily. He had 170 electoral votes by winning 15 states. Harrison was the leader among the Whigs. He had 73 electoral votes, capturing 7 states, but again, clearly not enough, and Van Buren became the president. Well, the Van Buren administration fared poorly, in part because he was rigidly, strictly holding up the Jackson policies that had caused the economy to go in the tank. Van Buren would not deviate from that, so there was an economic recession throughout much of his presidency. The White House was ripe for change when the election of 1840 came around. Well, Harrison, once again in the mix, and he was busy during this time. He gave a lot of speeches. Again, they were mostly not political speeches, but he was celebrated, a lot of military reunions, annual celebrations of some of the major victories in the recent war, and Harrison's service was almost always at the center, and he was happy to participate, gave a lot of rousing speeches, but again, not terribly political in these. The question would be now, who would be the nominee for the Whigs? After having 4 candidates in the last canvass, they decided to adopt this new model of having conventions where people from across the country would come together and pick a single nominee for the party to unite around. And that's what happened in December of 1839 when the Whigs came together in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. On the eve of this, one of the concerns about Harrison was his age. He was almost 67 years old and would be the oldest man to become president if he was in fact elected. Harrison came out on this and said he was going to counteract the opinion, which has been industriously circulated, that I was an old, broken down, feeble man. Upon this subject, it gives me pleasure to say that I was never in better health in my life. Well, his family physician, Dr. Daniel Drake of Cincinnati, also came out and echoed this opinion. He said publicly, I have been surprised at the vivacity and almost youthfulness of feelings. His intellect is unimpaired, bodily vigor as good as that of most men of his age, subject to no disease but periodic headache. So in other words, don't worry about his health. If you want him to be your presidential candidate, you go right ahead. So again, they got together December 1839, and the Whigs, this composite party, yes, they were aligned around Clay's particular American system on some of those topics we mentioned before, but they also disagreed on a lot of stuff. They were unable to come up with a platform here in 1840 because they couldn't agree on a lot of the issues, but they did agree on those economic issues along with the clay system, and they also agreed unanimously to be anti-Andrew Jackson, which was one of their biggest unifying points as they all came together to pick a nominee. Well, in the first ballot, Henry Clay was out on top, 103 votes, whereas Harrison had 91, and General Winfield Scott was also in the mix with 57 votes. But lurking in the background was Thurlow Weed, who was the editor of the Albany Evening Journal, very influential in sort of the startup of the Whig Party, and he had control of a bunch of delegates, particularly in New York, and he orchestrated a move on the second day of balloting for General Scott's supporters to go to Harrison, and that put Harrison over the top on the fifth ballot. And then they looked for a vice president. So they saw Harrison, even though originally from Virginia, he's viewed as a northerner. They wanted somebody from the South. They asked a couple of people who declined and eventually settled on John Tyler, a former Democrat from Virginia, again, a pro-slavery Southerner, wanted to make sure that the South was well represented. The one person who was most upset about all this was Henry Clay. He wanted that nomination. He said, "My friends are not worth the powder and shot it would take to kill them. It is a diabolical intrigue I now know which has betrayed me. I am the most unfortunate man in the history of parties. Always run by my friends when sure to be defeated, and now betrayed for a nomination when I or anyone would be sure of an election." Fortunately, though, for the Whigs, Henry Clay did not go off and sulk. He still was committed to beating Martin Van Buren and putting William Henry Harrison in the White House. The tone of this campaign was unlike any other, and it really kicked off right after Harrison's nomination in a story in the Baltimore Republican newspaper. The Baltimore Republican said, "Give him, Harrison, a barrel of hard cider and a pension of $2,000 a year, and our word for it, he will sit the remainder of his days in a log cabin by the side of a sea coal fire and study moral philosophy." This was ridiculing Harrison, but boy did it spur support as the hard cider and log cabin campaign was born. This became a craze across the whole country, celebrating the common man, which was sort of how this ridicule was painting Harrison in this negative light. Everyone else seemed like they wanted to rally around this as a cause to be celebrated. In fact, log cabins started popping up in communities all over the country. They had rallies. Of course, they served hard cider. It created a very positive mood. There were posters, there were banners, there were pamphlets, there were pins, there were all kinds of paraphernalia coming out in favor of the common man candidate, William Henry Harrison. There were also slogans. The most famous was first uttered by a pickpocket who was being escorted to jail in Richmond, Virginia, when he wanted to take a moment on the public square to announce his support for Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And that saying certainly stuck. Tippecanoe referencing Harrison's military victory over the Indians near Tippecanoe River, and Tyler being Tyler, you got Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And then there were the songs. Dozens and dozens of songs, books of songs that came out specifically for this campaign to cheer Harrison, condemn Martin Van Buren. One Democratic newspaper said, "Some of the songs I shall never forget. They rang in my ears wherever I went, morning, noon, and night. Men, women, and children did nothing but sing. It was a ceaseless torrent of music, still beginning, never ending. If a Democrat tried to speak, argue, or answer anything that was said or done, he was always saluted with a fresh deluge of music. If a Democrat would say that John Tyler was no Whig, the Whigs would join in a derisive laugh and a song which ended with the chorus, and we'll vote for Tyler, therefore, without a why or wherefore." Well, they come back to regret that last part about John Tyler, but the enthusiasm was certainly all in it for William Henry Harrison and this common man candidacy. It didn't seem to matter that this was hardly an accurate portrayal of Harrison and Tyler, and Martin Van Buren for that matter. I mean, Harrison and Tyler came from the elite families of Virginia. Harrison's father had signed the Declaration of Independence. Tyler's father had been the governor of Virginia. Both had been in political connections and political appointments since their early 20s. Even if you go beyond this whole idea of a log cabin, well, Harrison's log cabin was a mansion. It had 16 rooms in it. And as for alcohol, a hard cider, Harrison had recently sworn off alcohol because of the alcoholism of one of his sons. This was not an accurate portrayal, and yet Harrison stayed quiet during the campaign and watched all this enthusiasm. On the other side, there was the portrayal of Martin Van Buren, the incumbent president, who was this out-of-touch elitist. And certainly his fancy attire did not help, and his sort of personal or persona was not favorable to the impression. But in terms of his actual roots, he came from nothing. He was born in Dutch farm country, upstate New York, didn't really have anything to his name. He rose as a lawyer, moved up the ranks the hard way through the powerful rough and tumble activities in New York state politics. He broke through on his own skills and tenacity. His roots were much more aligned to the common man. But none of this mattered. The propaganda worked. William Henry Harrison and the country, he represented change. That's what they wanted. And Van Buren's presidency had not gone well. So it was not a surprise when the enthusiasm came out for Harrison. In fact, 80% of the eligible voters came out to vote, almost 2.5 million ballots. 60% more than the previous canvass, as this idea of democracy continued to expand as the franchise rolled out in the United States, and it ended up a landslide. William Henry Harrison winning in the Electoral College 234 to 60. He took 19 states to only 7 for Van Buren. Even New York, Van Buren's home state, and Tennessee, Andrew Jackson's home state, they all went for Harrison, who captured 53% of the popular vote. He was clearly the people's choice. He was ready to become the 9th president of the United States, which would be the briefest presidency in American history, but that is the story for another day. That is William Henry Harrison and a log cabin and hard cider campaign from The Life of William Henry Harrison. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.